Hi, I'm Pat,
Hi, I'm Linda.
and we've been friends for what, maybe 12 years?
Yeah, it's about that.
Yeah.
What is each other's favorite TV show?
I have to think, I don't know.
I'm not sure of yours either.
All right, 3, 2, 1.
News in the AM.
Oh, I said news.
Who is a better cook? 3, 2, 1.
You got that, didn't you?
Yeah.
We do Friday night at the movies, and sometimes I cook.
Use a microwave and, at Wendy's and McDonald's.
I've been known to send soup home in care packages.
All right, what is each other's shoe size? 3, 2, 1.
6.5.
Others?
No.
No, that's not my size either.
Well, the older you get, everything goes
Oh yeah,
south.
yeah, I know. These are bigger than I usually wear. Yeah.
What is each other's favorite food? 3, 2, 1.
I said coffee. I guess coffee's a food.
Yeah, well, we're going to say it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking it's Wendy's and it must include French fries.
Yeah, that's good.
Oh, brother.
Would each other prefer to watch a movie or read a book?
I do both.
Well, I do too, but I thought you had a preference.
Do I have to do a pick up?
Yeah, pick one.
Both? Is both one? I read a little bit and watch the movie.
Oh,
Okay,
well, I'm in
3,
trouble because I'm guessing you, and I didn't put both down. I'm
3,
sorry.
2, 1.
I said both.
That's true.
Well, it's so good to have all of you with us today from, all of our physical churches and those of you connecting online. Remember, we're one church right where you are. And last week, we kicked off this new series titled Verses, and the goal, the desire for all of us to have healthy, thriving relationships. There's a word picture I introduced last week that's going to guide us throughout this series. It's the word image, the word picture of an iceberg. And how we're using it is, so many times in our relationships, we focus on the issues above the waterline. But, here's the thing with an iceberg. 90% of it is below the waterline. This is where the danger is. This is where you need to focus. And so my encouragement for you is, let's get underneath the waterline and what's going on down deep. Now, here's what I know when it comes to all of our relationships. At one point, when you meet that person, whether it's someone you're dating, thinking about dating, maybe it's a new friend, maybe it's a work relationship, whatever the relationship is, at some point, you're kind of close together. I'm not saying you really know each other, but, you're close together. You're getting to know each other. At some point, in every relationship, this is true for every, and what I mean by every relationship, at some point, a gap emerges. It just does. Now, I'm not saying like outward gap, maybe, but most of the time it's an inward gap. It's, within our heart, it's within our mind. And, what causes these gaps? A whole host of things causes these gaps. And maybe someone tells a lie. Maybe it's an itty bitty lie, or maybe it's a really big lie, or maybe it's a series of lies that equal a lie. But you find yourself going, I can't trust that person. I can't trust that person. They say something like, I can't trust them. They tell you they're going to do something. And you're like, but are they really going to do what they say they're going to do? Are they really going to be where they say they're going to be? And you start questioning everything. Or maybe the gap is formed because, there's just unmet expectations. Maybe you've shared those expectations with that person and they're just not meeting them. But what we learned last week is, we as human beings only listen, to 7%, right? Because 55% is all about body language, 38% is all about vocal intonation. So literally, we're just listening to 7%. So out of all your expectations, they're only getting 7% of them. Or maybe you just have never shared those expectations with the other person, but yet you still expect them to meet your expectations, but you haven't articulated them. Maybe the gap has formed because, well, there's just jealousy. You know, that person got the promotion, that person got the job, that person, worked out, lost weight, looking good, and you're working out, kind of working out, not working out. Doesn't matter, you're still jealous of them. That person got the phone call, that person got invited, that person, and jealousy starts to creep in. Maybe the gap is because, well, just confidence is broken. You shared something with someone, you shared your heart, you shared something that you asked them to keep private, asked them to keep confident. And they shared with someone. I mean, this happens in the church all the time. It's tragic. As Christians, we usually, we need to pray for so-and-so, but in all reality, that so-and-so asked you not to share, but now you're saying, let's pray for them, and you're including their name. What I share with people all the time is we can pray for someone without ever sharing their name. Why? Because God knows who they are. But confidence gets broken, and now a gap emerges because that person goes, well, can I ever share with you again? Or maybe the gap is because it's just priority. The other person it doesn't feel like it's the same priority relationship. We could keep going on this list, but gaps form, don't they? So the question we got to answer, the question we have to answer is, what do we do? What do we do when a gap emerges? In part one, we looked at two relationships. It was a guy named Samuel who was a judge, a prophet, a priest, and God tapped Samuel on the shoulder to go anoint the first king of Israel. And, it wasn't who God wanted, it was who the people wanted. But, Samuel did what God asked him to do. So Samuel anointed a guy named Saul as king. And that introduced us or helped us identify the first battleground. We're going to be looking at 4 different battlegrounds across this series. And the first one was, doing right versus being right. Saul spent that entire time trying to convince himself and Samuel and God and other people that, he was right. And God kept on coming back to Saul and saying, Saul, you're focused on being right. I want you to do right. In fact, Saul, what's greater than sacrifice or worship is obedience. And God kept on saying to Saul, I want you to obey. That's what I've called you to do. But Saul kept on saying, but I'm right. And this happens in all of our relationships. We want to be right. And God keeps on saying to us, yeah, it's not about being right, but are you going to do the right thing? And you're going to see this battleground emerge as we look at the second battleground today. At the very end of the story last week, God, through Samuel, says to Saul, hey, Saul, because you've rejected the word of the Lord, God has rejected you as king. So now God needs a new king. So God tells Samuel, hey, Samuel, it's time to find a new king. I've rejected Saul as king. But Saul, and get this, he's still in the position of king. God hasn't removed Saul as king, but God needs to find a new king. So Samuel follows God's instruction. He goes to Bethlehem and finds a guy named Jesse. And Jesse has 8 sons. And Samuel goes, hey, I'm looking for the next king. And Jesse brings out his oldest boy, and right away Samuel's like, yeah, that's the king. He's the one. He looks like a king, he stands like a king, he acts like a king, right? He just has all the king qualities. And Samuel, remember, judge and priest and prophet, and he emphatically says, that's the king. But you see, Samuel got it wrong, and God's like, hey, Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Hey, Samuel, you got it wrong. And we got to just pause there for a moment. Again, Samuel was God's spokesperson. I mean, he was a holy man. He was really close with God. And guess what? You see all of Samuel's just, humanity. And God's like, hey, Samuel, you're looking at the wrong thing. You see, we as human beings, we like to elevate people here on this earth. And I keep on telling people, I'm as human as you are. At the end of the day, God isn't expecting our perfection, but he is expecting our pursuit, to follow him, to obey him. And immediately Samuel realized he got it wrong. Immediately Samuel realized that he wasn't right, but he needed to do what was right, and that was to follow God's lead. So Samuel looks at Jesse and says, hey, what about your other sons? And one by one, Jesse brought in his sons. And all of a sudden, he gets to his seventh son, and it's like, no, that's not the king. And Samuel says to Jesse, don't you have another son? And Jesse's like, yeah, I got my youngest, but he's out in the fields. He's a shepherd. He doesn't look like a king, definitely doesn't smell like a king. I mean, he's not old enough, mature enough, like all the list of things that you would have check marks for what a king would be. And Jesse's like, he's not your guy. And Samuel's like, hey, bring him in. And God said, yep, that's my king. So where we enter into the story today, Saul is still king, and David is going to be the next king, but it's on God's timing. The first really interaction we see between Saul and David is a fascinating story. I would encourage you to read it, but David is actually playing music for King Saul to help soothe him. Again, you should read that story. But you see a gap has already started to form. Why? Because what Saul knows is he's been rejected as king. Saul's position, his power, his authority, he knows at one point is going to be completely taken away. And Saul, instead of repenting and really coming back to God and saying, God, I want to follow you, Saul continues to focus on being right, not doing right. Because of that, this gap starts to emerge. Well, one day, David had been going back and forth from playing music for Saul and going back and helping his dad Jesse with the sheep. And one day he shows back up, and Israel's arch nemesis, the Philistines, they've drawn the battle lines, and for 40 days, a guy that the Bible calls Goliath, this massive soldier, had been, every morning and every evening for 40 days walking up to the battle lines and say, hey, let's just solve this by 1v1. Bring out your best soldier, your best fighter, and whoever wins, whoever lives, then that army will win the fight. And every time Goliath would emerge, we're told that everyone, all the Israelites, ran in fear, including King Saul. But David showed up that day, on that 40th day. He's like, what's going on, and who's that person? And here's what David knew, that God was with him, because David was focused on not being right, but doing right, and he was just following God. And in that moment, he took out his sling, and he picked up some stones, and he walked up to Goliath, and with one stone, he knocked Goliath down and killed him. The Bible tells us that David walks up to him, takes out his sword, and he cuts off Goliath's head. Saul hears about Goliath being defeated. He asks one of a guy named Abner, and said, who's this guy, and who's his family? I want to know more about him. So Abner goes, gets David, and we're told, the text tells us that when David walks into Saul, because Saul would have had a conversation with him, he was still holding Goliath's head. Could you picture this? You see a gap started to form, because David had courage, because he was focused on following God. And Saul lacked all courage, because Saul was relying on himself, not God. Saul promoted David, and he became a top leader in Saul's army. And well, the story started to circle around about David's courageousness as a soldier. Actually, people started to sing a song, and it spread everywhere. The song went something like this: Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And all of a sudden, what started to, move within Saul, what created a bigger gap? Well, jealousy started to emerge because Saul was king, not David. But the song was all about how David was a fearless, courageous leader. So Saul wanted to figure out how to, mitigate the situation, how to remove the situation. So he came up with this plan to manipulate David and him as king. And so he said, hey, David, why don't you marry my oldest daughter? And he just thought that maybe making him a son-in-law, that might be able to shift some of this. And then he could, manipulate David some more to put David in his place. And David said no to that. And then Saul discovered that one of his daughters, Michal, was in love with David, and David was in love with her. And so he goes to David and says, well, if you want to marry Michal, this is what you have to do. And he laid out that he wanted 100 body parts of the Philistines. And if you want to know what body parts those were, you just read it in the text. It's there. But Saul's motivation was to get David fighting the Philistines, so hopefully the Philistines would kill David. So David goes out to get those 100 body parts. He comes back not with just 100, he comes back with 200, and that doesn't solve Saul's issue. He tried to deceive David, but David, overcame that deception. And right after that, we're told that Saul feared David. Why? Well, this is the biggest gap. Because God's presence was with David and not with Saul. That David was following God, but Saul wasn't. David was focused on doing right. Saul was focused on being right. And all of this kind of hit a pinnacle that one day David was playing his lyre, something that he had done for years with Saul. He's playing music for him, and Saul literally picks up his spear and chucks it at David, trying to pin him to the wall, and David realized he had to get out of there. So that night, he escaped. And there he was on the run. Saul wanted David dead. And David was just trying to stay alive. And then one day, David and hundreds of, soldiers that were loyal to David, they were in this area called En-Gedi. En-Gedi simply means spring. There's natural springs there, and young goat. I love these names because they're just so practical. It was a place that had water, and shepherds would bring their goats to give them water. I've been to En-Gedi before, and it's an interesting place because it's desert land, but there is all these natural springs, and then also there's these mountain ridges that have caves everywhere. So David was hiding out in that region, and in 1 Samuel chapter 24, this is what the text says. He, Saul, came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went into, and I love these just real moments in the Bible. King Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, Saul had some 3,000 men with him hunting down David. He knew he was in the region, so he had gathered 3,000 men. This is a really large army, and all the support vehicles and the support people to help feed and carry all the supplies for 3,000 soldiers. This is a major operation. If you're just a soldier and you had to go to the bathroom, what would you do? You would just go anywhere along the road and then catch back up with everyone. But when you're the king, everyone stops. Everyone waits. And the king goes and relieves himself in private. This is what happens for the king. So Saul goes in to relieve himself. And out of all the caves, again, En-Gedi the hillside has caves everywhere. It's not just one cave. So out of all the caves Saul could have chosen, he chose, the wrong one. And we're told that David and his men were far back in the cave. So get this picture. King Saul was, in the cave, relieving himself, way in the back. David's there, and they all know. They all know what's going on. They all know who just walked into the cave. And David's men, guess what they whisper? Right? Whisper. Saul can't hear them. They whispered to David, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'Hey, David, this is your moment. This is your moment. This is it.'" King Saul's right there. He's in a pretty vulnerable position, right? Like, he has his robes off, his sword's laying down. Like, this is your moment. I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Now, these words that they will apply to God, you cannot find anywhere else. They're not recorded in the Bible. And this is a caution that we all have to realize. It's so easy for us to put words in God's mouth. If you've been a Christ follower for any length of time, you've done this. I've done this before. I caution people not to do this all the time. I try to make sure, with discernment and wisdom, not to do this. But it's so easy to say, God said, God said, God said, God said. And in all reality, did God really say? Or are you trying to put words in God's mouth? And that's a caution that we all should take really seriously. That's a caution that should weigh heavy on your soul. Before you say to someone, God said to me, and I'm going to tell you, did he really say that? Are you sure he really said that? Because David's men were like, hey, God said this is the day. This is the moment. Come on, David, go be king and kill Saul. And we're told that David crept up unnoticed. I think about this. Slowly, quietly, every step he got closer to his enemy. Every step. Think about what was going through David's mind. Yeah, Saul, I served you. I played music for you. And what did you give me? Hey, Saul, I married your daughter. You're my father-in-law. And you just keep trying to kill me. Hey, Saul, I was a captain of your army and I fought for you. And all you've done is tried to kill me. Hey, Saul, look at everything I've done for you. And you've done everything to, get rid of me. Could you imagine the mental conversation as David crept up to Saul? And this is what we do. We play these conversations in our heads, don't we? Who's that person right now that you have a massive gap with? And what's that conversation you have going in your mind about that person? It's real. It's real. And I could just sense the emotion within David as he crept up there, hand ready on his sword, his soldiers saying, hey, this is the day. God said, this is the day. This is the day. God said, this is the day. And David's playing back every time Saul had created the gap within him. But when David got there, remember, doing right, different than being right. And when he got there, we're told that he cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Got to pause there. Could you imagine the song that would have been sung if David would have killed Saul that day? I mean, you remember the song that people were singing. The song went like this: Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. I mean, what a song. I mean, one day David as granddad or great-granddad would be telling his grandkids, his great-grandkids about this amazing song, right? That's awesome. Could you imagine that? All of his grandkids everywhere. It's like, and they're like, hey, Grandpa, sing us that song again, the song that people sang about you. But could you imagine if David would have killed Saul while Saul was relieving himself in a cave? What would that song sound like? Well, I sat down and I was like, well, I could write this song. So this is how I think this song would sound like if David would have killed Saul while Saul was relieving himself. It'd go like this: Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. And David killed the king while Saul was peeing. Like that. I know. You can clap for that song. It's an amazing song. I mean, I'll copyright it, and maybe one day I will sing it and record it. Okay, I never will. But you think about this, right? Think about this. What story do you want to be shared? What story do you want to be told? What story one day to your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids? What story? I think in that moment, David was thinking through, what story? I think in that moment, he was thinking through, this isn't a story God is scripting. This is a story that some soldiers back in the back of the cave are trying to script. This is a story I'm trying to script myself. And we're told that, afterwards, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off the corner of his robe. And we have to realize the implications of just this decision. There's two implications for him cutting off his robe. The first one, there's a political implication. You see, the king's robe was a symbol of his authority, his power. And so him cutting off that corner actually removed the authority and power from Saul and his family line to David. But yet there's also a spiritual implication for this as well. You see, cutting off the corner of his robe made Saul ceremonially unclean. It was against the law of the Torah. And we're told that afterwards, David was conscience stricken. Why? Because he realized that the Lord forbid him. I mean, think about that. It's like, no. God said, don't do it. And David realized that doing right is vastly different than being right. He's like, God forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. You see, God had still placed Saul in that position of power. He had not removed Saul yet. And that was God's job. That was God's position. That was God's authority. And David realized in that moment that even though he hadn't killed Saul, he had still gone against God. He had still disobeyed God. You see, we think about this gap between David and Saul. Saul created this gap. David didn't. But in this moment, what did David do? David actually created the gap. He created the gap by disobeying God. And even though he didn't kill Saul, he still removed that corner of his robe, which leads to, the second battleground. Reflect versus deflect. David could have deflected and said, yeah, but Saul had done all of this. He threw his spear at me. And he chased me down. I'm hiding in a cave. It's my time to be king. David could have deflected the entire storyline, pointed to Saul and said, see the gap? Saul's fault. But David in that moment reflected and said, whoa. I have to own what I own. I can't blame him. I got to own what I own. And I know that it wasn't mine to take. God anointed him as king. It's in that moment of reflecting that David refocuses and says, God, Saul is your king. That's not mine to take. So David comes out of the cave. He says, my Lord, my king. And David fell down, laid down in an act of complete humility in front of his king. And he said, some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I won't lay a hand on you because you're the Lord's anointed. God still has you as king. He goes, may the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. See, Jesus said something very similar. I mean, completely different words, but it's the same sentiment. Hundreds and hundreds of years later, Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. We want to be the judge and jury in our relationships. When people wrong us, we want to be judge. We want to be right. We want to get our revenge. And in that moment, David's like, no. That's not mine to do. That's God. God is judge. I'm not. I'm called to obey God. I'm called to do what is right. Not to be right, but to do what is right, to obey God. And in that moment, he reflected and realized, hey, it's not my position. And I tell you, that's something that's so difficult because when we're hurt, when we're wrong, when a gap is formed and that person has created a gap, we want to get back. And Jesus said, no, love and pray. Love and pray. And Saul said, is that your voice, David, my son? And you could tell Saul started to change a little bit within. He goes, I know you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. It was David closing the gap that started to shift just a little bit within Saul. You see, which battleground are you going to focus on? Reflect, deflect. You see, deflect is above, it's above the water line. Reflecting is the hard stuff. It's underneath. It's down deep. It's easy to deflect, push off, cast blame, point fingers, tell someone to their face or not to their face all the things they've done wrong. It's a whole nother thing. It's a whole nother thing to reflect. What has God called you to do? It's a whole nother thing to pause in that moment when other people are screaming at you to be right. In the quietness, God's like, yeah, but are you going to do right? Are you going to obey me? My encouragement for you, what does doing right looks like? It looks like you closing the gap. You closing the gap with the person. You choosing. Whether or not that person has wronged you, no matter how much that person has hurt you, no matter how much you want to blame that other person, that you choose. You reflect on what you own. You can't own what they own. You can only own your percentage. But whatever that percentage is, own it with 100%, and you choose to go close that gap. I love that David said, hey, Saul, God still has you as king. And God is judge. But what I did, I own. David didn't own Saul's stuff. David didn't take on Saul's baggage. David owned what he had to own. Are you going to deflect everything on everyone else? Are you going to start reflecting on what you need to own, how you need to grow, what you have done, and what God has called you to do? Let me pray. Lord, I just ask, we spend more time reflecting, wrestling underneath the waterline. What have we done? What are the gaps we've created? How have we disobeyed you, Lord? How have we gone against what you have called us to do, what you have called us to be? And Lord, I just pray right now there's a name in someone's heart, there's a name in someone's mind, that there's a gap. I just pray that we will have the courage to go to that person and close the gap. That we'll have the courage, the humility, to own what we need to own and close the gap with that person. In your name I pray. Amen.